Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at World War I, Part 2, the second part of digging into World War I. We will have some follow-up lessons that come from this as well. But today our essential questions are, one, how did World War I spread beyond Europe? That is, how did these non-European nations or territories become involved in the war? And number two, how did the war affect the home front? Let's start by talking about World War I. This stalemate on the Western Front caused the war to shift to other fronts as well and involve more fighting. We see this throughout the colonized world. So we're going to focus on one particular area today, but just know that there was fighting in East Asia, there was fighting in Africa, but we are going to focus largely on the Middle East, where things were most impactful. This is because North Africa is largely colonized by the Allies, right? So France has a chunk of North Africa. Italy, which has now joined the Allies, has a chunk, and so does Britain. Britain also controls India, pushing toward Europe in this direction as well, which is leaving the Ottoman Empire, which has sided with the Central Powers, in a bit of a position. We can see on this map that the Ottoman Empire is largely surrounded by Allied powers. So they have a little bit of shared territory with Austria-Hungary and their impact in the Balkan region, this region right here. But the Ottoman Empire is really feeling itself very much surrounded in this war. Now, early in the war, there was an attempt to knock the Ottomans out and knock them out quickly. This was done with an Allied attack in Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli is an area near Constantinople, and it was felt that if the Allies could land an army successfully there, they could encircle Constantinople and take the Ottoman Empire out of the war early. This attack, however, fails miserably. It was poorly organized. They underestimated what the Ottoman Empire was able to do. Ottoman Empire just brought in these artillery weapons and pounded the British Empire forces, largely Australians and New Zealanders, who landed in Gallipoli. And it really was a devastating defeat for the British. So the British were not going to be able to take the Ottomans out quickly, so they had to shift tactics. And instead of going for the heart of the empire, they attacked the periphery of the empire. So this brought the war to the broader Middle East, as Allies used troops from North Africa and troops from India to encircle and attack the Ottomans from both sides where they were already weak. This weakness was really taken advantage of when the British went to the people under Ottoman rule who didn't want to be under Ottoman rule, and were able to encourage a series of revolts within the Ottoman Empire by promising greater freedoms to those people who revolted against the empire. One British officer in particular, this fellow right here, Lawrence of Arabia, is largely credited with this strategy, which does result in taking down the Ottoman Empire using largely Arab forces rising up and overthrowing their imperial master in the Ottomans. Another thing that comes into the war is submarine warfare. We talked a little bit about airplanes last time. Here we want to mention submarine warfare because it is going to lead to a broadening of the fight. So German Unterwasserboats, or U-boats, are basically submarines. And they're a very effective weapon for the Germans. The Germans cannot send out a fleet, a surface fleet, that compares with the British. The British surface fleet, their battleships, destroyers, etc., are just too powerful. But submarines are a very effective way to still strike at the British. They go undetected underwater, pop up, and hit the easier targets. Easier targets are sometimes passenger ships. In 1915, the Germans sink a British passenger ship called the Lusitania. When this ship went down, here's a image right here, 1,100 passengers aboard were killed when that ship sunk. The problem for the Germans at this phase of the war is that 100 of those passengers are Americans, and this is going to trigger an American response. So it doesn't immediately bring the United States into war, but the United States goes to Germany and lets them know how this is not okay. You cannot do this. And they come to an agreement with the Germans. It's like, all right, we're not going to retaliate against you, but you have to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. You can use your submarines against military targets, but only targets that are purely military targets. The Germans agree to this, but their boats are not being successful in, damaging the British economy. By 1917, the Germans are exhausted. Their economy is severely hurt. They're running out of resources. And the British Empire, being a much larger empire, being able to draw in resources from around the world, the British are doing much better than the Germans. So the Germans decide to flip back to unrestricted submarine warfare and start sinking any ship going to Britain, seeing that we've now entered into a phase of total war, which we'll get to in a moment, where all members of society are targets. This was a big point. A third point, we've got Lusitania, we've got resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and a third one is when the British intercept a communication between Germany and Mexico, where they see that Germany is trying to bring Mexico into the war against the United States. In this telegram, you can see the political cartoon here. It says, join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. They were saying, start this war. They're saying to Mexico, start this war with the United States. When we finish in Europe, we'll back you up. We'll make sure that you get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back from the United States. The U.S. had taken those territories some 60 years earlier in the Mexican-American War, 70 years earlier, ballpark. Germany's saying, we're going to help you get them back. Now, Mexico says, no, absolutely not. We want nothing to do with war with the United States. We know how that went last time. This was never going to happen. But the fact that Germany reached out was used as kind of the third reason for Germany, for the United States to declare war on Germany. So we're moving into a phase of total war. As war drags on, it's no longer just this quick fight, soldiers versus soldiers, the best military wins. The militaries are deadlocked. It's not going to be a war won by militaries. It's going to be a war won by a society as a whole, completely mobilizing for war. It becomes an economic warfare. So all citizens are now mobilized for the purpose of war. Now, nearly all healthy men are drafted into the military, and as the war goes on, you start to see, some range on who is considered a draftable soldier. It might start early on. It's like, we're going to take men between the age of 20 and 35, and then it becomes 18 to 40, and then it becomes 16 to 50 as the men are dying in the war. You can actually see this image right here of a child who served in the German army as a runner. This wouldn't be running around with a rifle, but delivering messages. They would use young children in wartime because the entire society needed to be mobilized and the casualties on the front were just astronomical. Atop from that, factories are all converted to producing war supplies. It really does become a full society war. When this happens, government powers also increase because you got to convince people to do this or sometimes force people to do this. People don't naturally want to give up all these freedoms or be forced to do certain things. So the governments are dramatically increasing their powers, cutting back on freedoms. Capitalist practices are put aside. If you own a factory, you don't get to decide what you're going to make anymore. You're going to make weapons for war. Wages are set by the government. Rent, rations, trade, transportation, all of these things become government controlled. And soldiers are all sent to fight, but this new phrase comes up and becomes very popular during the time that there was another front in the war. There wasn't just the Western Front, there was the home front. And what we did at home really, truly mattered. So we need to loan money to the government to help them fund the war. We need to make sure that the soldiers get sugar, and we're going to make do with molasses and sugarcane syrup. Or we're going to grow our own vegetables at home so we can eat vegetables because the farm vegetables have to go to the soldiers at the war. Now, again, getting people to agree with this, it means you need to have your public support you. So how are you going to do this when hundreds of thousands of people are dying, you've got less food available, and the government is limiting your freedoms? Well, in some societies, Germany, Austria, Russia, they simply rely on force. This is an image up here of a protest against the war in Russia, which is simply being broken up by armed soldiers, armed police. You can't protest. We saw similar things in Britain. Censorship of newspapers. People who are protesting could be arrested and tried with treason in Britain for protesting against the war. And on both sides, we see propaganda that encourages the war or tries to guilt people. We've got two pieces of Allied propaganda here. The Navy wants you, don't read American history, make it. Right? Don't sit back and do nothing. History is happening now, go be a part of it. And here the idea that the Germans are these brutish barbarians and they are stealing Lady Liberty in this case. And don't you want to save Liberty? Don't you want to save this young woman from being taken away by this evil brute? Come on, enlist, fight. So this is how the population was manipulated. During total war, we see an increase in the involvement of women in the economy and society as a whole. It's an interesting thing that we see many times in history is that war is generally good for women's rights within a country. World War I had a really positive impact on the women's rights movement. Women's jobs expand. We start seeing women having jobs that they've never had before. We see women's roles in factories expanding. Women have always been in factories, but much larger role in factories because here's a munitions factory down here making weapons. All the men are all fighting. We need weapons. Women were invited to work in those factories. And we see positive results from that in terms of women's suffrage. During the war in Great Britain and Russia, and then after the war in some other places like the United States, we see nations recognizing that women just did a lot for us. It's time that we, give them the right to vote because we need to correct this. Women have really proven their role in our society. All right, that is all that I have for today. I do hope that you learned something and enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.